Very good. Welcome everybody. We have a keynote distinguished lecture tonight with a very distinguished speaker, Janusz Korney, who came here today, actually not alone, but with his wife, Zsuzsa, and he also brought us a book, which you can buy there, but there is also a book to the students of New Economic School, which goes to the New Economic School library. So if the publishers run out of the copies, you can still come and read it in the library, or you can buy it in the stores. And I would like to thank Ilona Kish, the head of Hungarian Cultural Center, who's here with us here, who actually initiated the Russian translation of this book, which is now being published also in Hungarian, English, and Japanese, and there is also there are other editions which are probably underway. And this is a very fascinating book. It's a book, many of you have read books by Janusz Korney. This is a book about, not just by Janusz Korney, but also about Janusz Korney. And the distinguishing feature of this book, it's written in different style. It's not just a memoirs, it's an analytical memoir, where Janusz is going through his both personal and academic biography as an academic, and I think it's actually very fascinating to read this book. I read this book myself and I enjoyed it very much, and though not to steal the pleasure of reading the book, I would like still to introduce Professor Korney to you. Some of you remember, and this is actually documented in this very book. There is a picture of Professor Korney speaking here 4 years ago, with Gur Ofer sitting at this very table. And actually Professor Korney is the only person in the history of New Economic School to give this lecture twice. And we are very honored and happy to see this happening. There is another picture actually in the book of Natalia Volchkova, taken Professor Korney's lectures at Harvard. And I think this also symbolizes how small this academic world is, and how closely related these institutions in Budapest or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in Moscow are. And Professor Korney has gone through a very fascinating intellectual adventure, as this book is actually called, Intellectual Journey. He was born in 1928, so he's actually, in this book he describes his life through the Holocaust, through 1956 in Hungary, through the Soviet regime in Hungary. It is actually very important for us here to know how the intellectuals were working under a regime which was less free than Russia is today. And some of us in this room remember that, some of us don't. And this book is full of institutional detail on how intellectuals had to make their choices, how they faced ethical and moral dilemmas. What is also important, this book describes how Janusz came to write all these famous books on about over-centralization, about shortages, about soft budget constraints, the famous critique of the general equilibrium theory, anti-equilibrium. Again, many of you have probably not read that book, but much of that book is actually so much part of the common sense now that you probably don't know that these ideas date back to that book Professor Korney wrote more than 30 years ago. Many of the ideas do get recognized as Professor Korney's ideas, and you are being taught many of those in the classes, in the courses, and many of those are especially related to the centrally planned economy. But some of those get reintroduced and reproduced in modern writings, and one of these powerful ideas is soft budget constraints. This literature is actually developing very fast, and the most recent Nobel Prize winner, Eric Muskin, was actually Professor Korney's co-author on a couple of writings in this respect, and was developing models to formalize formalize this idea of logic constraint. But I wouldn't like to delay Professor Korney's speech any further. This speech is about what the change of the system actually means, the trial for clarification. It is related to one of the chapters in this book, as far as I understand, and Professor Korney will speak for about an hour, after which we'll have time for questions. Thank you very much for coming again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear friends, I'm happy to be here. I almost feel that I'm at home. So many friends, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. Today, the lecture I'm going to give today is got its inspiration from the demonstrations last year in Budapest. Perhaps you remember, you could see it in TVs, maybe also in Moscow TVs, there was a kind of very radical street demonstrations, and then mass gathering in front of Hungarian parliament for many days, angry speakers, very loud speeches, and some of the speakers at these demonstrations were calling for a new change of system, and were skeptical or expressed doubt that there was change of system at all in Hungary. One of the arguments was that there are so many familiar faces from the old system. How can we talk about a new system with the same people on the top? One can pass with a wave of the hand, but I want to take this question seriously and ask ourselves what does it mean to change the system. I don't want to convince Is it now all right? Yeah. I don't want to convince the angry demonstrators, but that is a problem or an area of problem which had not been clarified sufficiently among us, among people, professional researchers of systems. And I felt that some conceptual clarification might be useful. For the sake of illustration, I will always refer to the Eastern European post-communist countries, the 10 new members of the European Union. And coming to Moscow, I decided that I will not talk about Russia. That is your job. But if you can make use of the concepts I try to clarify, then please do it. And I present the ideas with the hope that they might be useful to clarify what happened in Russia, or where are we now in Russia, what is happening in China. But my examples will be Eastern Europeans and not Russia or China. I wrote a paper on the subject, and on the projector, I'm projecting the web address for the paper, so those who want to read the full text and tables and references should consult the paper. And that is, well, I will speak about an hour, that is only an extract of the longer paper. I want to separate two approaches all along. One is a positive approach. What are the empirically observable, historically existing formations what I want to call systems, and what are the empirically observable historical concrete changes, what I want to call change of system. And the other is the normative approach. What are the changes which gain approval or disapproval or disappointment, depending who makes a judgment. For this separation, for this distinction, the crucial criterion is the question to be answered. In a positive statement, we ask the question, is it true or false? And in a normative statement, we answer the question, it's what we observe, is it good or bad? And well, that sounds quite familiar, and each of us learned it. I think one reason of the permanent confusion is the confusion of these two approaches, including the Kossuth-Thayer demonstrations. Let me start with socialism or socialist system. What does it mean, the socialist system? Concerning a normative approach, for instance, for somebody who is a faithful and still faithful socialist, it is a highly laudatory term, a great distinction. And then, if he is a somewhat enlightened socialist, he would say that USSR and other communist countries do not deserve to be called socialist systems or socialist countries. As for a positive approach, we apply a very different route for definition. Let me start with an analogy. What is a dog? Using the Latin term, what is a canis familiaris? There is a vast difference between a huge Saint Bernardin dog and a tiny little Pekingese dog, and there are many other subspecies which look very differently. And they have different color, different size, different shape, different behavior. And yet, they belong to the same species. And this judgment doesn't depend whether I like dogs or dislike dogs. Zoology has a clear definition for that, and that is that is related to the breeding within the species. And that is sufficient, I underline sufficient, to determine, I'm looking at a dog or a cat. And now let's talk about the positive definition in my book. At the very end of my lecture, I come back to the, so to say, methodological or philosophy of science conclusion of that when we went through various definitions. So for socialism, I used in my book, The Socialist System, the following approach. There were, at that time, exactly in 1987, 26 countries which called themselves the socialist countries. And then I asked the question, what was in common in these 26 countries? And not only what, because there are many things in common, but what are the minimum common features? That's very important. We have to look at necessary and sufficient conditions to make the statement the country is an element of the set of socialist countries, or is it not an element of the set of... So we don't need the potentially most richest or most interesting description of a socialist country. It must be a minimalist approach. What are the fewest possible common features to get the result? And then my finding was that there are three and only three necessary and sufficient conditions. The first one is that public ownership is predominant and private ownership plays a subordinate or auxiliary role only. So the first is related to ownership. The second is related to coordination, and here the condition is that centrally directed bureaucratic coordination is predominant, and market coordination plays only a subordinate and auxiliary role. And the third one is that a Marxist-Leninist party has monopoly over political power, and that is a party that must be underlined, determined to eliminate private property and market. So it has a program, and it takes its own program seriously, and maybe at the beginning there is private property, there is market. But the party is destination, self-determination is to go ahead until private property and market coordinated, maybe not 100% eliminated, but almost eliminated. And that is taken seriously. So it's a hostile behavior against private property and market. If once these three conditions are met, then all the rest of characteristics will sooner or later emerge. The legal framework, the behavior of political and governmental economic leaders, socialization of majority of citizens, economics of shortage, and so on, that emerges all later as a consequence of these necessary and sufficient conditions. We are talking, when I talk about socialist system, we are talking about a family of systems. And within the family there are differences, like we had differences in the species of dogs. There is a difference between Stalin and Brezhnev over time. Or there is a difference at a given point of time between countries, difference between Honecker's East Germany, Zhivkov's Bulgaria, and Pol Pot's Cambodia. Yet, the three fundamental characteristics are the same. Now, let's turn to capitalism. What are, in the same spirit, the necessary and sufficient conditions to pronounce a country is operating under a capitalist system? We find, I arrive at a symmetrical definition. Private ownership is predominant, and public ownership plays only a subordinate and auxiliary role. Market coordination is predominant, and bureaucratic coordination plays a subordinate and auxiliary role only. And the third one is that there is no political power hostile towards private property and the market. It either supports its institutions actively, or at least it is benevolent and friendly towards them. Let me draw your attention that democracy is not amongst the necessary and sufficient conditions. Capitalism is able to operate under the democracy, but it is also able to operate under conditions of dictatorship, tyranny, and curtailment of human rights. Only necessary condition for the operation of capitalism is that the political power, while being, for instance, dictatorial or semi-dictatorial, is not hostile to private property and not hostile to the idea of a market economy. It is not my arbitrary selection of many properties of capitalism. Capitalism has 100 properties, and the literature is full of vivid descriptions. The methodology is the same as applied with socialism. Choose a larger set of countries regarded as capitalist by wide consensus, not only today, but looking back in the history of capitalism, observe empirically what is common, and then you can find that these three properties are common, while they might be different. And again, they can be different in legal framework, in the activity level, and the redistributive role of the state, in the degree of protecting human rights, in the influence of various religions. One can go across countries, and that over time one can see variations. Again, in capitalism we are talking about a family of systems. Just a very brief methodological detour. When I'm talking about two systems, I join an intellectual tradition pioneered by Marx. That is not a Marxist lecture. And my relationship to communism and socialism is certainly different. But this approach of distinguishing these two systems was certainly, Marx was not the first one, but the first influential thinker thinking in this dichotomy. He's not the only one. We get a very mixed series of others. He was joined by people like Karl Polanyi, by Max Weber, by von Mises, by Schumpeter. They like to think about capitalism versus socialism in this dichotomy. I have to mention that there is a completely different methodological approach which would reject this dichotomy, and instead would say that every concrete system is a blend of various characteristics. There are elements of public and private property in all systems, elements of bureaucratic and market coordinations and other coordination mechanisms, democracy and dictatorship, 5 or 6 or 8 various attributes. And then you can have a multidimensional space with all these characteristics and variables, and then each country is a point in this space. I like to use this approach when I distinguish members of the same system family. When I distinguish Pol Pot from Honecker, or when I distinguish Scandinavia from US today. But I insist that it has a strong explanatory power to make this dichotomy of two systems. It helps in understanding. Now, once we have in our at hand the definitions of the positive definitions of the two systems, it's easy to go to the meaning of changing the system. System change is completed when the necessary and sufficient conditions of a socialist system are not satisfied anymore, and the necessary and sufficient conditions of capitalism are already met. There is a transition when we are in an intermediate position, but when the first basically have been eliminated and the others are established, the change of system is completed. Using this framework, one can firmly say that 10 new members of EU completed the change of system. And that is a positive statement. It has nothing to do whether I like the present state of affairs in these countries or not. Let us take now a closer look at the political structure. Again, in a positive approach. In the region of the 10 new EU members, not only the minimum political conditions of a capitalist system were met, that is, that we have governments or political regimes which are not hostile against capitalism, but we had also a much deeper political change, dictatorship replaced by democracy, and political monopoly of Communist Party replaced by competition of parties. One element of conceptual confusion, at least in our countries, is the mix-up of the wider phenomenon, namely change of system, from the partial phenomenon, namely change of the form of government. It is, as I said before, it is not a necessary condition of changing the system, and communist tyranny can be replaced by other types of tyrannies. And there are historical examples for that. One historical example was the white terror in Hungary in 1919, following the red terror in 1919, the first Hungarian Soviet Republic. Another important example was the Pinochet putsch in Chile. Then there are many countries, I think, in the former Soviet Central Asia, which are absolutely certain that they are not democracies. And then I leave the question about appraisal of Russia for you. And I'm ready to come back to that in the discussion, if you formulate questions or make your comments, but it's not an easy question. But before answering the Russian case or thinking about the Russian case, let me try to find a definition for democracy in the same methodological fashion applied to capitalism and socialism. I really want to avoid any normative approach in that sense. So I don't approach the concept of democracy referring to the will of people, not even to human rights. Let's consider a set of countries today which by consensus are called democracies. Unquestionably democracies, that is Western Europe, including Northern Europe, of course, Northern America, and then a few other countries overseas, Australia or New Zealand. You can extend this set of countries. And then also include the history of these countries. As long you have to go back in history, as long you can call it democracies. And for instance, US is an important example for that. You go back to Tocqueville and all others who regarded US as a democracy. That's very important to include history backwards. And then I apply the approach pioneered in political science by the great economist and social scientist Schumpeter, who put the emphasis on the procedural side. We start not on thinking about rights, but thinking about procedures. And the minimum condition of a democracy is that the leadership of a country is chosen in a well-defined and institutionalized procedure namely in regularly repeated elections. It is done in a multi-party system where parties are competing for the votes. So, if you want to get rid of a leader, you then don't have to kill him. You don't have to make a political assassination. You don't need a military putsch. You don't need a junta. You don't have to put by mass invincible mass demonstrations to get rid of him. You go to the ballot and vote him out. That is a procedural definition. And then that gives you a test. You can be sure that you are living in a democracy if leaders, incumbent and even powerful leaders, were dismissed in a civilized fashion. Until that didn't happen, you cannot be sure. You can be sure only after that happened. And here I can refer back to the 10 member countries of EU. In each of them, this civilized dismissal happened at least twice. So they are not only tested once, tested twice. And a very recent test came now from Poland, very important test, that there was a fear that we are seeing an emerging dictatorship or an emerging tyranny. And then this prime minister was dismissed by a civilized procedure. Applying the criteria of the positive approach, we can now confirm the pronouncement that yes, the 10 new members of EU are democracies. And that is not, that is went through the test of being democracy. Here, a comment is needed in order to understand well the logics of the Schumpeterian approach. It gives you a test and not a measure of how good it is. It is not a normative measure. For me, I would also speak on behalf of my wife, a very important personal experience for understanding democracy was when we were in Sweden in 76, 76, and witnessed the election. That happened at a time when the Social Democrats were in power for 30 years. Their power was as long as the power of Hungarian communists, or longer than the power of Hungarian communists at the same time. And after ruling for 30 years, there was an election. The Social Democrats lost the election. Let me go back one sentence. There were many Swedes who felt that that is a one-party system. There is no other ruling power. They are ruling and ruling and ruling, and everything is happening at the socialist. There are people that are all around, in all positions, important positions were Social Democrats. And then came the election, they lost, and we remember, it's an unforgettable event, Olof Palme went on TV, and he had a smile. I wouldn't say that he was happily smiling, losing power after 30 years, but he was smiling, and he handed over power without the slightest resistance. When I'm telling that, I don't want to suggest that if you are living in an intermediate political situation, in the blend of authoritarian rule and certain democratic institutions, like legal existence of several parties, including oppositional parties, then just sit and wait, maybe wait 30 years, and then perhaps it will disappear. That is not what I want to suggest. I don't think that democracy wins automatically without fight. I'm just telling you what is the test of democracy, what is the criterion of democracy, what do we call democracy, and not what has to be done. That's a different question. Now I move to the normative approach. In the paper, I'm discussing several issues of the normative approach, including is there a third way, is there a third system, and I'll give a negative answer to that. But I don't have time to elaborate on that. I want to come back to the question raised at the beginning, and that is the question about changing the guard. I mentioned already that we can observe in many cases, even among very sharp-thinking intellectuals, mixing up positive and normative approach. And at first I give you the formula of the normative, of this mix-up. The formula of the mix-up is that, yes, we didn't finish change of the system because condition A or condition B were not met, and then condition A or B is not amongst necessary and sufficient conditions, but it is an additional, maybe very justified, normative demand. For instance, how can you talk about democracy when there is a lot of corruption? Yes, you can talk about democracies. There are democracies which are full of corruption. How can you talk about democracy when there are gross violations of human rights? Yes, there was a working American democracy with slavery, which is one of the most cruel violations of human rights. But it was democracy, and applying the Schumpeterian criterion, presidents were peacefully and in a civilized way dismissed. One or two of them were shot, unfortunately. So it's not always so peaceful, but at least there was available of a peaceful way of removing them. If people were dissatisfied, and this recurrent removal of the dismissal of the law led later on to the historical development which abolished slavery, extended the human rights of black people, and so on and so forth. So this typical confusion between normative and positive exists with the changing of the guard issue. How can you talk about changing the system when you don't change the guard? When you or use a term of sociology, there is no sufficient change in the elite. And then here my answer would be that that is not amongst the necessary and sufficient conditions. And there were countries running through long periods of democracy while you couldn't see a radical change of the guard. In my paper I use more than one example. Here I want to mention only British history, which has of course a leading pioneering role in development of democracy. Now, it started with monarchy, with absolute monarchy. And the rule and the tremendous power of the peak or the top of the aristocracy. Nowadays, now let's jump 200 centuries, nowadays the role of the aristocracy didn't disappear completely or 100%. It is still part of the ruling elite. There is even a House of Lords, where you have lifetime peers and also have who are appointed for merits, but they are still inherited lords, and they have some power. And in the 200 centuries in between, there was a gradual shift of the elite, rivalry between business people and landowner aristocracy, and gradually more and more members of the new elite. But there was not one single year when you could say that all the elite was just eliminated and replaced by the new. There was in history only one great transformation, which got very quickly rid of all the elite, and that was started about 19 years ago. Yesterday we had the 90th, and that was a radical change in elite. Not 100% radical, because some of old members survived, but the most
20 years.
Certainly the most radical shift in elite. All other great transformations, and we are talking here about the great transformation, you had a gradual shift of the elite, and that is something which is observable with the means of sociology and surveys and personal histories, very important subject. I just heard about a study about the Chinese elite. That would be very interesting to look into more details. In Hungary there were several such studies, and at the beginning there was a theory that we have a nomenclatura bourgeoisie. That was a term that just the whole nomenclatura took over and became the bourgeoisie, which was never true. There was immediately a start of changing the elite, but not eliminating the old elite. Now, I would say that in the economic elite, in business world, about 1/3 comes from the old elite and 2/3 from the new, are not. And then you have many problems in all these statistical surveys with how to define the elite. There was the typical movement is that somebody who was on the 3rd or 4th level of the hierarchy moving upwards. So he was not out of the old elite, but had a relatively low position and then moved upwards. And some others who were very high up moved downwards, but did disappear completely. They are still members of a board in a certain company, because it might have some advantages to have a member with his old connections to his club members. So we see a gradual and continuous shift in the composition of the elite. And then you can have a normative position. You want to speed it up. For instance, I dislike to see the faces of certain people in the new elite, and I would like to not to see them. But that is my own normative approach to that, and that I have to distinguish from the positive approach that changing the guard, especially radically changing the guard, is not a necessary and sufficient condition. And that, for instance, is very important for understanding the Chinese scenery. I come to the final conclusions of my talk. First, I would like to make a few remarks from the philosophy of science point of view, or the methodological point of view, how do we create a concept, or the definition of a concept? I find many of my fellow economists don't even think about this issue. And it's not fashionable, for instance, in economic training, to talk about methodology or philosophical aspects of theory constructions. There are I cannot give you a special paper now on methodology, just a few hints. We are full of ad hoc concepts and ad hoc definitions. You have a model, and then say in your model, in the world of your model, you have a variable representing investment. And then you say that investment is a variable in this model. That's it. You don't think about it more, and you don't ask whether that is such a strong definition than what I try to give about the dog, which is a very strong definition of what is a dog. Then there is another very characteristic approach, and that we apply in economic theory, where we follow the tradition of mathematics. We start with an axiom. Axioms used in mathematics in various chapters of mathematics have a higher validity or broader validity of a large set of issues, but in axiomatic decisions theory, we start with an axiom, we start with axioms. An axiom, that is meaning of the concept, you don't prove it, and you don't define the concepts used in the axiom, they are the primitive concepts. But then, in a deductive theorizing, you can arrive at concepts, definitions derived from the axioms. So you reach your secondary and tertiary conceptual framework by deduction. And that is a rigorous approach. Might be very important, plays a very useful role, and that is one way of arriving at rigorous conceptual frameworks. And in our basic general theories, we use this axiomatic way of defining concepts. What I try to do is an inductive way and not a deductive way of conceptualization. You observe a certain set of phenomena, and you ask us criteria how to decide whether a particular phenomenon is an element of that set, or it is not an element of the set. And you find that it's in some sense also rigorous, and should be rigorous, but it's another way of rigor, and certainly very different than to say that here is a model, I have 6 variables, these are my definitions for certain concepts. So it's not simply an ad hoc improvisation that within my model, but I'm using it as a distinctive criterion is refutable. You can point out that, look, here is a country, and you cannot apply your concept to that situation. And then I can find in some cases an easy way out, calling that an exception. You cannot have an exception in deductive mathematical theories. But in inductive conceptualizations, you can have exemptions and fuzzy cases. That is quite permissible as long as you have sufficient explanatory power. In that sense, it's much less rigorous. You cannot demand, and not only you cannot, you must not demand the same rigor. My favorite example for that is the distinction between male and female. And that is a very workable distinction, and in most cases you can decide work on animals, on human beings, is it male or female. And then there are hermaphrodites where you cannot decide clearly on that. I don't say that I don't care, because these are existing creatures and organisms, and they are truly hermaphrodites, and you cannot tell them whether they are men. And nevertheless, I think that the male-female distinction is a workable distinction. It is applicable to the huge majority, the vast majority of cases, and therefore I feel justified to work it. Here one has to be very cautious with is it a transition? We have operations where you can turn from male to female and from female, and then there are a few days or a few months when he or she is an intermediate. So is it a transition from one, or is he stuck with this unclear situation? That requires, but still I suggest to try to build up conceptual apparatus which work, and then also to think about the not quite clear cases. The other comment is not on methodology, but on, I would use German term Weltanschauung, worldview, also a philosophical comment, but of another branch of philosophy. I don't know how it is in Russia, but I know...
That is the very same word.
Yeah, no, I want to talk about the Weltanschauung problem. In Hungary, in my own country, but in many other Eastern European countries, people are bitter and feel many bitter and feel disappointed and are sad and upset and angry, frustrated. And if one starts to ask the reasons for that, they point out quite rightly many phenomena which are good reasons for being upset, unhappy, dissatisfied, disappointed, and so on. And in the meantime, they forget about world historical importance of changing the system. In this approach, or these topics I chose for myself for this lecture, doesn't, of course, replace hundreds of concrete studies of, I don't know, standard of living, income, growth policy, financial policy, stabilization, and so on and so forth. Also, concrete reasons for people being unhappy. And I wish that we economists and social researchers would be more productive and more helpful in that. But once in a while, it's worthwhile to stop for a moment, take a deep breath, and think about world history and about capitalism, socialism, and democracy, and the fundamental importance of these issues, and understand what happened here and what is going on here, and then continue our daily work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, and unfortunately these issues are very relevant for today's Russia, and I guess there will be many questions. Questions? Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so
There is a mic somewhere.
Well,
Yeah, it's done.
maybe I can start without RQ as a matter.
There are two questions. The first one is related to your today's presentations, and the second one, if I may, to the soft budget constraints. With respect to today's presentation, the question is not whether the countries will make a transition to democracy. Yeah, probably in 50 years all countries will be democratic, right? We don't have any doubt about that. The question is, what is the way? Yes, what is the route to democracy that we take? And one view, and to cite the most famous example, Fareed Zakaria, he has a book about it, is that there are two ways. One way is first you introduce the rule of law, and then you make a transition to democracy. This was the way of European countries in the 19th century. First, you ensure the basic rights, including the right to guarantee contracts, and the right for property, and the rights to be free from ethnic discrimination, and the right for a fair trial at the court. This was the route that was taken by East Asian countries. Just think about Hong Kong, which was not democratic under the British, which is not democratic today, but there is definitely the rule of law. So the theory says that when you make a transition from the strong rule of law to democracy, then everything is okay, and this is good for your economic development, and this promotes your economic development. When you make a transition to democracy without initially creating a strong rule of law, then you get Haiti. Haiti is the oldest democracy in Latin America. Democracy was introduced there in the beginning of the 19th century. For 200 years, they had 30 coup d'etats. Every time they have the elections, in 6 years, they have a coup d'etat. So this transition to democracy, when you first democratize without having strong rule of law, is sort of a, bad path, right? And this is something that does not enhance your economic performance. And there are studies that actually show that this is the case. Now, if you accept the view that there may be a trade-off between democratization and other developmental goals, according to Asian values, not according to Western tradition, but according to Lee Kuan Yew and people like him, you can sacrifice democratization for the sake of achieving higher economic growth rates. Now, the question is, what is your take on that, right? Is this kind of compromise possible if we accept that there is a trade-off between the developmental goals? And the second question is about soft budget constraints. If you apply the notion to the Soviet-type system, then it may be misleading in a sense that it is true that in Soviet-type systems there were huge subsidies given to enterprises. But this was a state policy. The state had its industrial policy, whether it was good or bad. These were priorities, right? And these funds were given to maybe wrong industries, and they were not developed, squandered, and so on. However, if you ask the question whether it is easier to get a subsidy for the enterprise today, a subsidy which is not consistent with the general strategy, right? Or it was easier to get it in the Soviet times, well, the answer is pretty clear. Today, in Russia at least, the corruption is much higher than in Soviet times. So you can get a subsidy for virtually everything through crony relations, and in this way, the soft budget constraints are much softer today than they were in the Central Atlantic one. In the Central Atlantic one, it was a hard budget constraint, not only budget but life constraint, because under Stalin times, if you don't fulfill a plan, you may end up losing not only your salary but also your freedom. Thank you.
Both comments, it were not really questions. They were comments. As for the first one, I will disappoint you because I don't have a recipe for how to get to democracy. And I have my strong doubts whether such a recipe does exist. Whether in any universal sense. I would start with my doubts concerning your first sentence. Please correct me if I don't recall it exactly, but you said that no question about it, and in a certain time maybe you mentioned 15 years, 20,
50.
I would be absolutely uncertain. I don't. I would honestly tell you, I don't know. We know from theory that there are bad equilibriums where it is extremely difficult to move out. There are traps. In world history, there were unchanging societies for very, very long periods. So I'm not sure. Maybe you need 10 years, maybe my answer would be there is no automatic trend toward democracy. I wish you can show me what are the unevitable historical forces which guarantee me that even if I do nothing, a democracy will come. I'm not sure. So in that sense, I'm more, so to say, a fighter, telling that democracy will depend what kind of actions citizens are doing, and not by say that economic growth will be fast and then so for this choice whether we should start with rule of law or start with political conditions of democracy and then rule of, I don't have an answer. But that is my disappointing reply to your first comment. The Hong Kong story, I think, is a unique story, and Singapore is another unique story, and China will certainly be an absolutely unique story. And I cannot derive rule from other countries' story to give a prophecy what will happen in China, because that is one of the really most important issues for the world. You mentioned the second aspect of the same problem, sacrificing democracy for democracy, and you refer to Asian values. I don't know. Asia is a too broad concept for me, not clear. India is quite a part of Asia, and a very large part, a huge country, which didn't sacrifice democracy for growth, and now it is growing while maintaining democracy. So I don't want to go along the way to say yes. Maybe for Europe, we Europeans want democracy, but for the Asians, it's okay that if they sacrifice democracy for growth. That is not a positive question. That's a very deep, value-loaded question, and. I, for one, don't subscribe to the idea that it's worthwhile to sacrifice democracy for growth, because in my eyes, in my system of values, democracy is just extremely, outstandingly important. Certainly among the first ones. Among the primary goods, and nothing I would be ready to put on the second place. Let me not verbatim quote a Hungarian poet, or one of our classical poets is Petőfi, Sándor Petőfi, and he was a great freedom fighter, and he wrote a beautiful poem, The Song of the Wolf and the Song of the Dog. And the dog says that I'm licking the feet of the master, and I'm well fed, and have a warm place to live. And then the wolf says that I'm starving and it's very cold around me, but I'm free. There is also a position on sacrificing democracy for development. But if it took his word seriously and he ended his life with, on the battlefield for freedom. So that's a value question, and not simply, in my eyes, it's not a positive question. It's a very deeply normative question where everyone has to take his own position. What I find important that I would reject a double standard here. I remember, maybe I'm even quoting it in my autobiography, a long conversation with a Swedish student who at the time was on the radical left side. And he explained me that democracy, that is a luxury for the Westerners and the Asians. They don't really need it. And I was very upset. If you need democracy, then you cannot say that the others don't need it. It's only for us, spoiled Westerners. So that is my point on the issue. But I am aware that here various views and various approaches. At least I wanted to be very clear about my own position on this matter. I find your remark on subsidies and soft budget constraint under present conditions very remarkable. And do empirical studies exist which would show that? Because I would be happy to see such studies which show that it became even softer. So here I could imagine that. I can understand social context. So that's an empirical question which is very important. It's certainly true that there is no such simple formula that capitalism, hard budget constraint, communism, soft budget constraint. That is a gross simplification of the issue.
Okay. Other questions? Let me follow up on that question and ask you about China. You mentioned it's a whole separate case, and you mentioned 3 criteria of the new system and of the old system. And it's not easy to classify China along these lines, right? Because the party is referring to itself as a Marxist-Leninist or Communist party. It doesn't seem to be very much against private property or markets, and still, so there is the whole big question what's going on in there. And then the other question is what drives Chinese communists? Why is this regime so seemingly benevolent, or to some extent benevolent? It's not a very nice regime, you know.
To tell the least.
Sorry?
To tell the least.
Yeah, exactly. But we've seen much worse regimes, and again, the predecessor of the current regime was also much more costly in terms of human lives and political rights. So what's your take?
Predecessor meaning before
Mao? No, Mao. I would separate. Yeah, I would separate Mao from the current regime.
Yeah.
So what's your take on this? Where is China heading things?
Yeah. First, I was thinking a lot about the problem, and my views, so to say, developed according to the observations in China. And I would like to start. I have 3 criteria. As for the first 2, I would call China a capitalist system, or almost a capitalist system, or very safely on the way to become a capitalist system in a quite clearly foreseeable future. Yet it's, I have to look at statistics. I think even today I would call it a capitalist system, and for a capitalist system, my third criterion is only to have a political power which is not hostile to private property and market. Now, certainly the political regime is not hostile to private property and not hostile to market. It is rather friendly. So, in that sense, I just call it a capitalist or almost capitalist regime, system. And then one have to, that is how I put it in my framework. And then I would ask the question, what kind of phenomenon or what kind of entities what today is called Chinese Communist Party? Let me use Marxist-Leninist language for that purpose, because I think it's apt to use it in that context. That is a renegade party. That is a party which became bourgeois. When I speak about Communist Party in my definitions of the social, then it is a Communist Party which takes the program of commune seriously, and they want to eliminate private property and not welcome private property, or becoming private proprietors himself. What is happening with many Chinese nomenclature people. And that is not against market, trying to eliminate. For a true Bolshevik, market is something disgusting. And private property is something disgusting, and it's an enemy, it's a class enemy. And you don't try to become yourself. I think if Lenin would be alive, and he would be the head of the Communist International, he would drive out the Chinese Communist Party on the first day, as a party which doesn't belong to them. It's not a Bolshevik party, it's not a Marxist party, not a Leninist party, it's not a Maoist party, it's a party calling himself, but they were kings in the medieval time calling themselves followers of Christ, and it has nothing to do with Christianity. And so it's rather anti-rhetoric. And then it's a very interesting sociological phenomenon and the phenomenon of cultural history. Why is it so important for the party to be called Communist Party, And that is related to the issue why symbols are important, why names are important. The Communist Party is a strange and unique formation. Never in history existed something like the Chinese Communist Party of today. You cannot compare it to any other Communist Party. I started to ask Kat about research on China's party secretary, but what I observed and what my Chinese friends are telling and what one can read in many papers on China is the following, that there is an intertwining between the Communist Party, nomenclatura, and business. It can be personal. I met in China an owner of a medium-sized pharmaceutical factory and asked him what is the relationship with a local with a party organization within the company. And I said, that's fine. And what about your relationship with the party secretary? I have no problem, I'm the party secretary. Now, try to imagine the early Bolsheviks and meeting somebody who is capitalist, bourgeois, owner of a factory and party secretary at the same time. That has nothing to do with Communist Party. So understanding the true nature of the Communist Party, and then you have no problems in putting China at the place. Now, with seemingly benevolence, first, in history there were many benevolent monarchs. It's not the only one. The issue of tyranny versus democracy is not good or bad, because you can have a good monarch and a very bad democratic government, which is corrupt, incompetent, and disqualified. That is not. So maybe they do a lot of good things in China for economic growth, but there is clearly, not quite clearly, but more or less clearly determined frontiers how far you can go in criticism. Today, you don't have to teach Marxist political economy at the Chinese university, which had to be taught in a Soviet economic faculty, I don't know, 30 years ago. It was mandatory to teach Marxian political economy and to pass exams on Marxian. That is not in China anymore. But you cannot speak out freely about Chinese policy concerning Taiwan. You cannot say a single word publicly. Not even our friends who have their own view. Maybe at the dinner table they can talk about it, but there is no way of telling anything about Taiwan. There is no way to speak on any relevant issue of foreign policy. So benevolence has its limits. And if that becomes crucial, then you why should we agree with the foreign policy of the Chinese leadership in the future? Maybe they will do terrible things. And there is no way, if you have no democracy, there is no way of even protesting, or even to make a slight protest against it. So there are certain basic issues which you cannot question. And then you cannot question, you cannot dismiss the leadership. The leadership can be dismissed by the procedure, which is a very strange procedure, but not in the civilized process of political competition. So I don't know, I wouldn't use, somehow economists got used to the term benevolent dictatorship. I don't think that historians would use that. I never read it in history books. Somehow we apply it because it's so easy to put a model on economic policy assuming that there is a benevolent dictator. Okay, but their benevolence is rather limited.
Thanks. Yes, please.
How well horizontally integrated is the Chinese ruling elite?
Compared to... Okay, I'm sorry. The question is, how well horizontally integrated is the Chinese ruling elite compared to the Soviet ruling elite? And by horizontal integration, I mean the number of people that a person keeps contact with who are on the same level in their hierarchy as is he.
I would be glad to know the answer. I don't know, and one of the problems is that as far as I can observe, empirical, good literature on studying the political regime of China is rather limited. And insights are partly anecdotal, but anecdotal evidence can be very important. So I don't know the answer. I don't know. Maybe your data set can be used to look at how often do people change if they are provincial leaders, how often they go from one province to the other, because that's one form of horizontal integration, that he is not a member of the province, he is a member of the general staff of the headquarters, and if needed he goes to region E, but if needed he goes to region C or D. So that could be one way of observing it, but I don't know. My guess is that in both cases we have huge verticality. China is so immensely large, and so I have a little bit of personal experience with the publication of my books. And it turned out that a book which was not, my friends were not able to publish in one province, they could find some connections and then publish it in another province. And so in my own tiny little country, which is less, the whole population is less than Beijing's population, it all goes to the Central Committee during the communist regime, and they didn't know exactly who are the two people who say yes or no. But in China you can play more around, so there is some verticality and not a complete perfect hierarchy, except in some fundamental issues like foreign policy. In the provinces closest to Taiwan, you don't have a separate foreign policy. That is highly centralized. Probably military remain highly centralized. Maybe also the police. Certainly the Chinese equivalence of KGB is still centralized.
Let me add, not all the people in this room know that Professor Korney's seminal work was on game theoretic modeling of communist bureaucrats. That was 50 years ago. And actually, one of Janusz's students is also a Katya's co-author, Wing Chen, wrote a theory of hierarchy 15 years ago. Now, Wing is himself a bureaucrat, being a dean in a state university in Beijing. So you can actually write to him and ask this question. Maybe he knows anecdotal evidence better.
Yeah, you really know it better. He knows the limits also better.
Yeah, but he still remains a professor at Berkeley, so he can run when the limits. Further questions? Any more questions? We have a couple of minutes for questions. No, okay. So let me thank Professor Korney, and I encourage you to get this book, buy his book, and maybe Professor Korney has a few minutes to sign a few copies. And there will be a reception downstairs, so you can have a drink and discuss these matters further. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming, for inviting me.